So it's a pleasure to be having a session called Approaches to Economic History and the History of Capitalism. As the chair, we do believe that history is constitutive of how theory should be understood. And I do think that this topic can also help perhaps give insights on a question that emerged in the last session, which is ultimately how historical approaches can help advance critique. Critique in the sense, again, not just of building the content of the theory, but at problematizing the social relations of production that we take for granted, a lot of times also as economists. And I think looking at it longer-term historical evolution of our capitalist system and its origins is very important to maintain the element of critique, which is so important for the heterodoxy, strong and ultimately in our minds. So we have a wonderful panel. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. First we have Trevor Jackson. Trevor Jackson is professor of history and political economy at the University of California, Berkeley. And his first book is Impunity and Capitalism, the Afterlives of European Financial Crises, 1690 to 1830. That was published with Cambridge University Press. And he has a new book coming out very soon with Norton with Norton Press, with the title that is unclear yet still, but it's going to be certainly a great success. When is the next one coming out?
End of this year.
Okay, end of this year, so look out for it. Here we are, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Clara, very much. Right, as she says, the title's up for grabs, so if one of you can think of a good title, let me know. Wonderful. Am I audible in the back to the other? Great. All right. Well, thank you to Clara and Scott and Bruno for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. And I especially want to thank Jisoo, wherever she went. I don't know if any of you have ever planned a conference, but it's an enormous amount of work. There she is. And I think she's done a fantastic job, and so thank you very much. Great. So I think I also should probably clarify, since I'm the first person who's speaking, that there has been some change in the lineup of the panel from what was announced, so don't be alarmed. Both Branko Milanovic and Robert Brenner couldn't make it, so we have happily substituted in some other people. And these aren't my slides, but I'm so excited to see what David's going to say that I thought this would be, a good way to keep our attention. So I think rather than speak a bit about my own current work, what I wanted to do was maybe speak a bit more methodologically about what history might have to say to heterodox economics and what heterodox economics seems to me to say about where history and economic history is going at the moment, which I hope will set up my co-panelists. I hope to be compelling to the non-academics in the room and perhaps provocative to the academics. So there have been many invocations or maybe hopes that economic history will have something useful to add to this project. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but economic history is at the moment, I would say, in a very parlous state. It is mainly dominated by economists, orthodox economists, far more so than historians. And they mostly, under the long hegemony of the influence of Douglass North and what's called the institutionalist approach to economic history, have treated economic history as though it's a kind of testing ground for neoclassical theory. What they often call institutions, but what they mean are the micro-foundational behavioral approaches to economic history. And so in this way, we've had now decades of mainly economists doing what I find very dreary work, testing things that are mathematically complex but conceptually obvious. The last economic history conference I was at, I saw a paper that was entitled, "Are Roads Good?" And the answer after 5,000 lines of MATLAB code was yes. So look, That has produced a cumulative body of knowledge, mainly trying to test the causal claims coming from neoclassical economics. But what that means is that my interlocutors are mainly orthodox economists. They are the people who I mostly speak with, because at the same time that economics has taken over the work of doing economic history, it's mostly been abandoned by history departments. And that history departments, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, took what we call the cultural or the linguistic turn. And most historians have become interested in questions about meaning and symbols and understanding rather than material economic processes in the world around us. And so for that reason, economic historians like me in history departments are sort of orphans, and we mostly are unintelligible to our colleagues and can speak only to economists from outside. So that's a challenging position to be in, and one that may or may not be changing for reasons that I'm going to go on about at some length. And so it seemed to me that it might be interesting to start by thinking about what economic heterodoxy might mean right now, and what writing a history of economic heterodoxy and the role of history in heterodoxy might mean at this moment. Because it seems to me that we are in a moment of transition, that something is happening and has happened, and that specifically in the world of economic thought and economic policy, that many of the orthodoxies, especially around what you might call neoliberal globalization of the last decades, are being abandoned. Branko couldn't be here, but Branko has just had an article on his Substack to exactly this point. Now, I don't want to push this idea too far. Clearly, whatever we mean by neoliberalism, if that means, in the Wendy Brown sense, the reconfiguration of many aspects of social, political, and cultural life into economic, market-based terms, well, that process is still alive and well. And if we mean neoliberalism in the Quinn Slobodian sense of insulating property from democratic accountability, we are, if anything, at some high point rather than at the death of that moment. And it seems to me that whatever changes are happening in the world of economic theory and economic policy have not been driven by the failures of the crisis of 2008 and some reckoning with how we got there, let alone an opening to a conquest by heterodoxy, but rather have been driven by kind of sinister xenophobic worries about realpolitik and the rise of China. And so it's not coming from the direction that we might like it to be coming from. But nonetheless, it seems to me that we are at a transition point, and that what heterodoxy may mean from now going forward is likely to be different than what it might have meant 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And for that reason, if indeed this owl of Minerva is taking flight, it might be that this is a time to re-narrativize the recent past in economic theory and economic history. And that seems to me to be a vital task, because I would also argue to all of you, and this picks up somewhat on some elements from our last panel, that the history of economic thought consists largely of insurgent, rebellious movements who, in the process of establishing their rebellion, immediately tell a new story about what preceded them. And so in this way, we could say that mercantilism is, to some extent, the invention of Adam Smith to attack it, and that classical economics is, to some extent, the invention of the marginalists, or later of Keynes, creating a school of thought to attack. And Keynesianism is, to some extent, the invention of Paul Samuelson in 1948. And indeed, the story of the Friedmanite neoliberals coming to power in the 1970s, they tell as a story of intellectual triumph, that the Phillips curve had failed, Keynesianism had failed, stagflation had disproven it, and that they offered a better story. Well, I mean, there's an entire book by James Forder arguing that that's entirely wrong, and that when we look at the policy statements of people in the 1950s and 1960s, they are not expressing the things that Friedman would later claim they were expressing, and that we see this story emerging immediately in textbooks written by neoliberals arguing that this is why they have succeeded, rather than the story that they have succeeded through like a ruthless expression of naked class power. And so what that seems to suggest to me is that the act of re-narrativizing what came before is a constitutive element of the production of some new, both heterodoxy and orthodoxy. And I also think that in the development of the history of economic thought lately, we have moved away from a model that's predicated on a kind of Thomas Kuhn, Imre Lakatos story of paradigms that are overthrown, let alone an orthodox economic story in which economic thought is the progressive unfolding of greater truth and science. But rather, I think we're moving towards what I think I might pretentiously call a schismogenetic view of economic thought, which is to say, birth through schisms, and that we get a kind of proliferation rather than a linear succession. And so I liked Scott's model of the nonlinear course of economic thought. And so rather than saying that there had been a world of classical political economy and then in 1870 we have a world of marginalism, well, look, from 1870 to 1948, what the Austrian marginalists are doing is different from what the Lausanne marginalists are doing, which is different from what the Marshall people are doing, which is different from Oxford, which is different even in the US. The institutionalists in Wisconsin are doing a different thing from the institutionalists in Texas. And that rather than lumping them all into one narrative, we can say that there is this kind of proliferation that only retroactively gets flattened into one body of thought. And I think for heterodoxy, that opens up some possibilities, because it seems to me that heterodox economics has a different relationship to its own history than orthodox economics does. We've heard a great deal in the last couple of days about the utility or the need for returning to old books to understand our current moment, and that perhaps we need to understand what Piero Sraffa was saying in 1927. Perhaps we need to think about Joan Robinson, perhaps we need to think about Marx, perhaps Ricardo, and perhaps in order to understand those people, we need to understand everyone who came before them. Now that's a very different approach than what orthodox economists would say. Orthodox economists seldom cite anybody more than 5 years before when they are writing, because they have a scientist, or in their scientistic, you might say, vision of what they are doing, and that anything past is obsolete. Well, the recognition that the past is littered with useful tools is an advantage. It's an ability to draw on lost options, lost possibilities, right? A wider range of potential options. But it also, I fear, can be a trap. It can limit us into thinking that the past offers us the total set of potential options and might limit us in our ability to recognize and to think the new. And that I would suggest to you that what heterodoxy must mean from now on must be in some tangible way different than it would have meant in the 1990s or the 1970s. And I think that one way of approaching this, through this different vision of the history of economic thought, is to recognize that economic thought proceeds not through the pure intellectual conflict of ideas, but rather through struggles for resources and power. There are struggles for resources and power within institutions, within universities. The triumph of the marginalists at the end of the 19th century was absolutely co-constitutive with the creation of universities. And the people who were the leaders of the marginalist revolution were the first generation of university professors, who were economists as opposed to policy people, lawyers, commentators, etc. Right. I think we can recognize that this struggle for power, and a political struggle for power, is at the heart of what, in fact, this project is. So, one move recently in that direction has been something known as the new history of capitalism. This got a great deal of attention in the 2010s. It seemed to be the reaction to the 2008 crisis. There was some hope that it might bring back together history and economics after their long divorce, and it profoundly has not. If anything, I think it may have made matters worse. The new history of capitalism comes mainly from Harvard, led by Sven Beckert, and to a lesser extent elsewhere, Ed Baptist, Walter Johnson. This is something that has grown to great public attention. It's mainly focused on the histories of slavery and racism in the 19th century United States, which are important and valuable subjects, but are perhaps not the entirety of the history of capitalism. And as I think we're going to hear about a bit more soon, the history of capitalism as a field has chosen deliberately not to define what it means by capitalism. They view the idea of doing so would be exclusionary to different possibilities, but what that's meant is that there is no coherence. There is no coherence in what they're talking about. There's no political coherence. There's no methodological coherence, except insofar as their project is explicitly or perhaps anti-Marxist, and opposed to any degree of engagement with the past history of economic thought. And so I think that's led us into a dead end. I think it's collapsing as a force for bringing these things back together. And for that reason, thank you. For that reason, I think that there is also opportunity. I myself have found a great deal of interest among graduate students in what you might either call the history of economic life, meaning how people experience economic events on the ground, and on what you might call the social history of economics, which is to say the way that economics as a discipline is produced in these material struggles for power that I've alluded to. I taught a class on this in the fall, a graduate seminar. I had 30 PhD students the first day from 9 different departments, which I took as an indication that there was interest in this subject. Now, to move to the end, I say all this Because what I think I know from the history of orthodoxy and heterodoxy, not just from economics, but in general, is that most emergent rebellious movements tend to face three tasks. The first is that they need to define their objective, what they are trying to achieve with their rebellion or their heterodoxy. They also need to define their adversaries, including at a systemic and a structural level. And I think they need to define and dispute the distribution and redistribution of available resources. And it seems to me, from what I think I know about heterodox economics and from what I think I've heard over the last couple days, is that I think heterodox economics is perhaps strongest on the second point. It is very clear who is the opposition, especially at a structural and systemic level. Heterodoxy is very good at thinking at structural and systemic levels. I think the third point is in this moment of transition, that on the one hand, there is a positive story to be told about the available resources. The intellectual resources have never been more robust than they are now. The demand, especially from the student and graduate student and indeed public level, is very strong. The Che is one example of these new resources becoming available. My own university at Berkeley is one of 6 that got a pile of money from the Hewlett Foundation, I think hoping to save themselves from revolutionary justice. It won't work. Which is funding a center on political economy, which in turn is attempting to produce what they describe as alternative common sense to neoliberalism, whatever that may in fact mean. So perhaps material resources are advancing, but we also shouldn't fool ourselves that the access to policy making and to the levers of power has probably never been more inaccessible rather, than it currently is. Right? And I also think that we are not yet at any degree of coherence about what the objective is. And I think that some of us over the course of the last few days have assumed that the objective is attempting to wrest control of the economics curriculum from orthodox economists. Right? And so is the goal that Harvard's Ec 10 curriculum should stop being Greg Mankiw's neoclassical book and instead should be Anwar Sheikh? The world would probably be a better place if that was true. But that's a different goal than trying to provide useful tools and useful histories to on-the-ground labor organizers, which in turn is a different goal from, say, trying to influence economic policy at all of the levels of cost-benefit analysis from the local school board, all the way up to central bank policy. Those seem to me to be different objectives with different tools and different needs for resources. I tend to think of an objective because it's the one that I know and that I think I can actually affect at a curricular level, that I can train students differently. That must be a part of any of these goals, but it can't possibly be the end. So I doubt, unfortunately, that the Friedmanite long march through the institutions is something that heterodox economists can reproduce. Pet billionaires are few on the ground for the left. And access to those kinds of institutional resources is structurally more challenging for us than it is on the other side. And, because I began as the bearer of bad news, I will also end that way, we also should be aware that the academic job market is in a state of structural collapse. And so, although we may train at a curricular level generations of clever new thinkers and heterodox economists and different historians of economic thought, if there are not jobs for them to get, that's going to limit the impact of anything that we're trying to do. This is especially true in my own world of the subject of labor history, which should be the most direct and applicable to the labor organizers in the room. We should absolutely be producing usable, tangible labor histories, but the field of labor history has been annihilated in the last 5 to 10 years. Nobody is writing those books anymore. Nobody's writing those dissertations. A clear, I think, act of deliberate political, intellectual vandalism. But all of that also suggests to me that thinking about heterodoxy now means thinking not only in a moment of newly narrativizing thought and the processes that got us here, but also confronting what's new about our current moment of crisis and being realistic about what our current objectives may be. And so I'm just going to end on a final pitch for the utility of studying history, both in a world of heterodox economics, but even more broadly than that, for those of you in the room who are not academics. This is my pitch for the utility of studying history, which is to say that most people, if asked, would say that the point of studying history is something like you learn lessons from the past, or perhaps you learn the mistakes of the past so you don't repeat them. But strikingly, almost no historian thinks that. Most historians think the past is fundamentally different. It's a different context. People had different ideas. It was a different world. They had different options available to them, and we should not project ourselves into the past. So what's the point? Well, the point, I would argue, is that learning history is in fact a radical, emancipatory, imaginative act. Exactly because, as Clara said yesterday, learning history is all about denaturalizing the elements of the world around us and recognizing that anything in the world that seems permanent, natural, and inevitable is not. It was created by people at a particular moment. And when we historicize things, what we are doing is learning that moment. And when we learn that moment, what we do is we realize that there was a world before. The world used to be different, and if the world used to be different, it can be different again. And not only can it be different again, but moreover, when we learn history, what we realize is that when we struggle for a better world, we do so in solidarity with each other across space. We must do it in solidarity with each other, from Tulsa to Gaza. But we also do it in solidarity across time. We do it in the footsteps of the people who came before us, right? They hoped for a better world in the future. We are that future they were hoping for, and we have an obligation to them to continue the struggles that they began. And when we hope for a better world, we in turn have an obligation to try to pass that on to the people who come after us, and to think of ourselves in solidarity in a community that spans both space and time. And in that sense, history allows us to not only think differently about the radical possibilities of how the world can be different, but also holds out the possibility for those of us struggling for a better world of realizing that we are not alone. So, that's my speech.
We have the pleasure of having David McNally with us here, chair in the history and business at the University of Houston, where he directs the project on race and capitalism. The author of 8 books, wonderful books that really shaped many of our thinking here. McNally won the Deutscher Memorial Award for Monsters on the Market, Zombies, Vampire, and Global Capitalism, and the Paul Sweezy Award for Global Slump, The Economics and Politics of Crisis and Resistance. His book, Slavery and Capitalism, A New Marxist History, will be published by University of California Press in the summer of 2025. So we're almost there. Thank you. Floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Clara. And let me start by thanking Clara, Jisoo, Scott, Bruno. This is an amazing launch that you've pulled off. But I also want to say to everyone else in the room that we have an obligation to stand with them and to support their initiative. Critical spaces like this for the production of critical theory and practice constitute what my friend Alan Sears described as infrastructures of dissent. They're places where critical thought and critical practice can incubate. And they will always come under assault. And they will need people who are prepared to stand in solidarity with them. So all of us who came as guests, observers, and so on, have a real obligation, I think, to continue to extend our support and our solidarity in every way that we can. So thank you for that. You've heard from Trevor that the 2008-9 global economic crisis also triggered shockwaves in the historical profession. Historians all of a sudden discovered that they had no capacity to explain a momentous set of events associated with a global economic meltdown. That's a pretty major deficit if you're historians, because they recognized that this was a turning point, and we're still living through the after effects of the global slump of 2007 to 9. As a result, the turn that Trevor rightly described as the new history of capitalism emerged. And in many respects, the return to capitalism as an object of analysis, and also the recognition that it has a history and is not the product of nature, not the product of an innate propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another, as Adam Smith says in the opening of The Wealth of Nations. But it has a history, which, as Marx tells us, is dripping in blood and dirt. My biggest problem with the new economic history of capitalism is that the blood and dirt is generally missing. The reason for that is an obsession with financial instruments that has run through the new history of capitalism, so that, as one pundit has put it, we are offered a capitalism without blood. And a capitalism without blood is a capitalism without the laboring body. And if Marx's critique of political economy is about anything, it is about the return to the laboring body. It is about centering the laboring body in the production of value as the heartbeat of the system. And this is why the concepts of labor power and living labor are absolutely indispensable foundations for everything that passes itself off as any kind of Marxist political economy analysis. So the book that Clara mentioned that I have coming out with the University of California Press, Slavery and Capitalism, is an attempt to intervene in this debate to clarify the stakes and to recenter the production of global commodities by an enslaved workforce as what was foundational to New World slavery. You'll see it, I call it a new Marxist history because I'm actually taking on a lot of ostensible Marxists. This is a debate within Marxism as well. And I'm also trying to insist that to do this project properly, we need to rehabilitate key classics of what has not always helpfully been described as the black Marxist tradition. But here I'm speaking particularly about C.L.R. James's magisterial account of the Haitian Revolution, the Black Jacobins, and W.E.B. Du Bois's great account of the Civil War in the United States, Black Reconstruction in America, which advanced the provocative and I think if anything, still yet underappreciated claim for the general strike of the slaves as the key to the triumph of the Union in the Civil War. Now, I want to be clear that in making the case for the capitalist slavery, capitalist character particularly of British West Indian slavery and the slavery that emerges in the 18th century in the U.S. South, that this is not a world systems theory claim for those of you who know it, which simply says that as soon as the world market touches an area, it's automatically fully capitalist. I'm making a different claim, which is that the New World slave plantation was founded on the real or direct subordination of labor by planter capital. What this means for those of you who know the debate over formal versus real subsumption of labor in Marx is that these were not labor processes that were only formally subordinated to capital. Plantation laborers were directly subordinated to production processes organized, assembled, regulated, and disciplined by agents of capitalism. And here, the discussion of what's known as the gang labor system is critical. And you'll see I have a passage there which I'll go through with you in a moment. But I begin, therefore, by making the following claim. Plantation slavery was about the massive systemic production of global commodities, tobacco, rice, cotton, sugar, coffee. It was mass commodity production. It was organized directly by means of bonded labor, and I advanced the concept of bonded labor power in the book, which I'm happy to come back to. But most importantly, I want to remind all of us of Marx's claim that the indispensable element of capitalist production is that capitalism absorbs the power of human cooperation. If you look at Marx's famous chapter on cooperation in Capital Volume 1, he says that this is the immense productive power that capital harnesses, the powers of human cooperation. Later, it harnesses them to increasingly mechanized production. But the critical, if you will, first step is to regulate and discipline cooperative human activity. Give you one quick passage from Marx, quote, "Capitalist production only really begins when capital employs a large number of workers on an extensive scale and yields relatively large quantities of products. This," Marx says, "is a new productive power, which is intrinsically a collective one, but it is organized under a system that is purely despotic." And that's critical, because gang labor on the plantation system is the extreme point, I argue, of capitalist despotism. All organization of work in capitalist society is despotic. It is all authoritarian command system structures of labor and mobilization of labor power. So this passage, which is from William Dixon, Letters on Slavery, talks about the movement of bonded workers through the field in unison, and he says they begin and finish a row of holes. This is, in this case, cane holing for sugar. They begin and finish a row of these holes as nearly as at the same instance as possible, so that this equal task must be performed in the same time by a number of people who, it is next to impossible, should all be equally strong and dexterous. This is the standardization of labor, the material social organization that we refer to as abstract human labor, which seeks to quantify all movements. And so you get the standardization and quantification of labor time. It used to be common for historians to say the two institutions which institute bells to regulate time discipline were the factory and the school. The problem is they left out the plantation. The plantation was regulated in precisely the same way, with bells, horns, and so on. And in fact, some wonderful historical research has shown us that watches and clocks were actually more widespread through the US South in the 1830s than they were through the North. That the use of bells, whistles, and clocks and mechanical devices for the keeping of time was actually more widespread there. Now, I don't think a lot is solved by simply quoting Marx to solve historical problems, but I think every now and then we come across a formulation from Marx that can be extremely useful and got it up. No, I've somehow lost it. Let's try again. There we go. The price that is paid here for the slave is no more than the anticipated and capitalized surplus value or profit that is to be extracted from him. Now, I'm not going to take you through this. Marx is here talking about what regulates the price of land. And he essentially says, you capitalize the rent. If it's 5%, you stretch it out over 20 years to get 100%. I'm massively simplifying. But the key here is the price of the slave is regulated by surplus value production, which is capitalized. In other words, Marx is not at all put off by the idea that plantation laborers are producers of surplus value in the course of producing commodities. And I think that insight is quite critical. But more important, ultimately, is that if we examine the actual forms of resistance of plantation laborers, of enslaved workers, what we discover is that there is both what I call in the book a proletarian moral economy, one in which theft from the master class is completely valorized and even called appropriation. To appropriate is the term that's used over and over by enslaved people when they steal from the master class on the basis of a very rudimentary labor theory of value. We produced it, it belongs to us. And secondly, that enslaved laborers, contrary to wide number of misconceptions, regularly fought to limit the length of the working day and the work week. Over and over and over again, they fought to reduce what Marx calls necessary labor, to reappropriate time for human life. In other words, I'm trying to make the claim that these bonded workers in some of the largest workplaces in the world, and that's the point that C.L.R. James is making in the Black Jacobins here. In 1740 or 1780, workplaces of 300, 400, and 500 laborers together constituted among the largest workplaces in the world. The sugar estates, in this case, of the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, what becomes Haiti, or Jamaica, and so on, are in fact massive workplaces. Moreover, enslaved workers regularly engaged in strike action. And this is something, again, that historians have come to appreciate but have not been able to integrate adequately into a full and robust kind of account. Here, I'm only going to give you the case of mass strikes. This is a set of mass strikes running from the 1790s all the way through the general strike of the slaves during the Civil War in the United States. But I will emphasize for you the second last one, December 1831 to January 1832, the mass strike of at least 30,000 Jamaican bonded laborers who refused to work as part of an uprising that basically forced the British Empire to abolition. And the leader of this uprising, this insurrection, Samuel Sharp, specifically argued for a general strike. This was the political strategy. And when arrested, a group of enslaved workers explained their motivations. We have worked hard enough already and will work no more. We won't be slaves no more. We won't lift hoe no more. We won't take flog no more. In other words, the general strike had become an instrument of mass struggle and mobilization, and what W.E.B. Du Bois does with his marvelous claim that effectively the Confederacy in the United States was broken by the withdrawal of hundreds of thousands of workers from the plantation system. The key thing being, of course, that to strike also means to escape. You have to leave. You have to physically depart because you're bonded. Labor power. And that's what we see, and of course, as historians know today, about 200,000 former enslaved men enter Union forces, predominantly the Army, but also nearly 20,000 into the Navy. And Du Bois's claim is this breaks the back of the Confederate economy and is the key to the defeat of slavery. I want to make one final point as I draw this argument to a conclusion. If this is the case, then not only are we saying that New World slavery was part of the capitalist mode of production, but it follows that these struggles of enslaved workers were an integral part of the history of the global working class. We need to reintegrate this history into global labor history. Global labor history has been developing as a field, but this dimension of it has been left too far behind. In 1789, there was an uprising in Santana, Brazil, very much like some of these that I've put up here. The workers, the enslaved workers, set 19 conditions for returning to work. One of them included workers' control of the means of production. They were only going to return if they controlled the mills, the boiling houses, and so on. They also demanded Friday, Saturday, and Sunday off from field labor and from work in the mills and the boiling houses. And they, explaining it, they put in their list of 19 demands that this time would be claimed, quote, to play, relax, and sing anytime we like. I just want to suggest to you that that too is an indispensable vision when we talk about a society beyond capitalism. When we talk about a vision of an emancipated society, the idea of human beings being relieved from toil sufficiently to have time to play, relax, and sing anytime we wish ought to be part of our vision. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. So now we have Stephen Maher, who is an assistant professor of economics at SUNY Cortland and co-editor of the Socialist Register. His work focuses on the role of the state and finance in the development and internationalization of American capitalism from the 19th century to the present. He's the author, with Scott Aquano, of The Fall and Rise of American Finance, from JP Morgan to BlackRock, that came out with Verso just last year, 2024, as well as Corporate Capitalism and the Integral State, General Electric and a Century of American Power, with Palgrave, 2023. The Fall and Rise of American Finance is truly an important book, and rethinking, as he will probably hint to, the relation between industrial and financial capitalism as it's been understood also in the Marxian tradition. So we're so happy to have you here.
Thanks a lot, Clara. And honestly, I want to echo my former teacher and actually ongoing teacher, David McNally's comments at the beginning, just on what an incredible initiative this is, and to extend my strongest congratulations on this incredible launch to Clara, Bruno, Scott, and Jisoo, everybody else who was involved in this. This is really tremendous, and I really hope that it continues. Unfortunately, as you heard, Robert Brenner and Bronco are not able to make it today, so you have the understudy. I'm sorry to break the bad news. I also didn't have the time to put together a PowerPoint because I wasn't necessarily supposed to be presenting, and so but that's okay with me because as my late mentor Leo Panich used to say, power corrupts, but PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So no corruption here. I'm going to suggest that understanding the historical development, how we understand the historical development of finance, the giant corporation, and the state are central to how we think through the most pressing political questions that we now face, and how we understand the role of finance, and how we understand the role of the corporation in having changed and interacted with the development of capitalism over time has a huge bearing on how we understand the political task that we now face. So there's a direct connection between how we see the history of these institutions, which are the central pillars of contemporary capitalist society, and how we understand the political struggles to change them and ultimately overthrow them. My work, like David's, challenges a lot of the work that's been done, including by some of the best Marxists, I think, in framing this history, which oftentimes consists of a narrative that argues that the development of capitalism over time has led to reduced competition as the concentration and centralization of capital proceeds, competition declines, leading to stagnation and general malfunctioning and decline, ultimately the decline of the capitalist system. I argue on the contrary, following the work of many important Marxists, some of whom were here, including Anwar Sheikh, that capitalism has actually become more competitive with time, not less, and that this has happened because of, not in spite of, the development of the giant corporation and the financialization of the economy. In other words, my central claim is that capitalism is not broken and in need of being fixed. On the contrary, it is working correctly and in need of being overthrown. So, thank you. So I make this case in my two books that Clara just mentioned by challenging two central myths which pervade a lot of left thinking on these institutions and the history of capitalism. First, the idea that class power emerges, the power of the capitalist class emerges through the capture of the state by the capitalist class, and that it takes the form of lobbying by giant corporations which take possession of the state from outside and force it to do their bidding. In other words, the state only does capitalist things because capitalists force it to do. My mentor, Leo Panich, who I mentioned earlier, used to call this the waitstaff theory of the state, where the capitalist class calls up the state every morning and instructs it how to behave and what it should do in order to reproduce capitalism. On the contrary, the implication, of course, of this claim, of this myth, I would say, is that the state is neutral. It's fundamentally neutral, and therefore it can become a workers' state simply by limiting lobbying or campaign contributions or whatnot, and therefore workers can then take control of the state through winning elections and make it into a working class state. On the contrary, if we look at the way the state developed historically and institutionally, we see that the state is in fact much better seen as what the Marxist state theorist Nikos Poulantzas referred to as a relatively autonomous state. That is to say, not directly under the control of the capitalist class, but at some distance from particular capitals, navigating the contradictions and conflicts between competing individual capitals as it articulates the general interests of the capitalist class as a whole. Now, by debunking this myth, I'm also criticizing economism, right? The idea that class power doesn't just emerge automatically. It's not just given. Class power has to be organized and formed. The power of the capitalist class has to be organized and formed through the active role of the state, which, not coincidentally, also disorganizes the working class. So the capitalist class has the capitalist state to organize its power. The working class is going to have to organize itself. This isn't to say that the struggle for reform is pointless and that reforms can't be won on the terrain of the state, because indeed they can and have been. Rather, it's to say that winning reforms and gaining state power requires more than just winning elections. It requires a much deeper and fundamental transformation of the materiality of the state. And I think the current efforts being undertaken by Elon Musk and the far-right government that's now come to power in the United States are somewhat instructive in terms of the kinds of transformations of the state that are possible and indeed necessary, albeit from the left, should the left come to power. And I think the left has not come up with a program to do so, other than simply contesting elections. The second myth that I challenge is this idea that financialization has led to the hollowing out or decline of industrial capital, and that the rise of finance in the global political economy, especially since the 1970s, has come at the expense of industry. So as finance rises, industry falls. And the idea is that finance constitutes a kind of vulture capitalism, or consists strictly of fictitious capital, appropriating Marx's concept, I think, in a way that is not exactly what Marx had intended, but is a particular development or a particular understanding of the concept of fictitious capital, such as in the recent book by Cedric Durand. That the argument is that finance is somehow parasitic on industry, and its rise leads to dysfunction, the hollowing out of the real economy, and that actually the poor condition, the increasingly precarious position that the working class finds itself in is not a result of the balance of class forces and the fact that finance has strengthened industry and thereby increased the exploitation of workers, strengthened the capitalist class. But on the contrary, the argument is that the rise of finance has somehow, in weakening the working class, also weakened capitalism. But of course, those of us who are familiar with Marxist theory can understand perfectly well that the weakening of the working class is perfectly compatible with the strengthening of capital. And that's indeed what has gone on. And so the suggestion that comes out of this work, sometimes explicitly, as in the case of social democratic writers like William Lazonick, sometimes I would argue implicitly, is that workers should form an alliance with industrial capitalists, that is to say, their bosses and exploiters, in order to rein in the true parasites in the economy, which are the financiers. And supposedly, because finance is draining industry of its vitality and of its strength, industrial capitalists have an interest in joining with workers because they share a common interest in confronting the parasitic financial sector. I argue that this is not happening and is not likely to happen for the very simple reason that industrial capitalists have benefited from financialization. Financialization was a solution, not a problem, for capital coming out of the 1970s crisis, laying the groundwork, the infrastructure for globalization that first of all opened up the vast low-wage workforces of the global periphery to exploitation, reducing labor costs, increasing profits, and overall restoring the power and vitality of industrial capitalism coming out of the 1970s. even though the process of globalization may have damaged individual capitals through the intensification rather than the reduction of competitiveness that entailed, the power of the capitalist class as a whole was strengthened. So competition may damage individual capitals, but it strengthens the power of the capitalist class at the expense of the working class. And I argue that this, in my recent book with Scott Aquano, The Fall and Rise of American Finance, I argue that this competitiveness, this intensified competitiveness of capital in the current period, has been reinforced, not challenged, by the extreme concentration and centralization of corporate ownership in the post-2008 period in the hands of the big three asset management companies, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, who have become the most powerful institutions in contemporary finance. Now, in order to understand the claims I'm making here, and I may not have time to get to everything that I want to say, we'll see how much time I end up having, but in order to understand the claims that I'm making here, I need to explain or lay out a theory or an argument made by the economist John Weeks that basically most mainstream and even critical economics, such as the Monthly Review School of Marxian economics, adheres to what one might call a quantity theory of competition, according to which competition is a function of the number of sellers in a particular market. As the number of sellers declines over time with processes of concentration and centralization, competition also declines, right? Classical Marxian economics, and Scott Aquano and I, argue that competition is actually better understood as a function of capital mobility. Competition occurs as capital flows into those investment outlets which generate relatively high returns and flows out of those investment outlets with relatively low returns. So as capitalists are seeking to maximize their profits, they invest where the profits are, and they allocate their investment to those sectors where profit rates are the highest and pull it out of those sectors where profit rates are the lowest. Now, the large corporation is the most mobile form of capitalist organization. It is most able to allocate investment as cheaply as compared to other possible ways of organizing capital across space as well as across sectors. So the large corporation then is more, not less competitive. Similarly, the development of the financial system in the United States since the 19th century. In our book, we start with the days of the robber baron J.P. Morgan, and we carry the argument all the way up to the current moment with the rise of the asset management companies. And we show how the development of the financial system has increased the mobility and competitiveness of capitalism. First, integrating the national market in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and then ultimately facilitating the global integration of the capitalist system at an international scale, whereby the entire planet has come to be integrated into one singular global capitalist system. And that this has tremendously enhanced the competitiveness and aggressiveness of capitalism, not resulted in its dysfunction and malaise and stagnation. So I have a couple of comments I wanted to make about the institutional Marxist methodology that I've used in this work, which effectively argue, I'm not going to get too into it. I have a book coming out on this methodology. The manuscript will be submitted hopefully in September, and it will be coming out soon thereafter. But the basic idea is that that capitalism's history does not unfold in accordance with the blind operation of structural laws. On the contrary, capitalism is produced and its structural drives are realized through institutional forms that are constructed by really existing concrete human beings. Now, I always find that a little bit strange, concrete human beings. I use it a lot, but I don't mean human beings made out of concrete. I mean actually existing, living and breathing human beings who create institutions, and the capacities of those institutions determine the trajectory, and the contradictions determine the trajectory of capitalist history. So the question that emerges from this kind of methodology is how and why did the capitalist system evolve in the ways that it did? And what does this history tell us about the structure of power and the possibilities for working class advance today? The purpose, my purpose, in writing with this methodology, in the recent book, that The Fall and Rise of American Finance, certainly, is to demystify the operation of the financial system and to illustrate its central importance for organizing the political and economic power of capital, and thus its importance for working class struggles to gain control over investment. In other words, in short, to demonstrate the necessity of and possibility for an authentically democratic socialist order. And I think that points to the need for a political program that goes beyond, for example, the popular call to break up the banks and restore competitiveness, right? Capitalism is already competitive, and it's not good for workers. Workers do not have an interest in restoring competitiveness. Workers have an interest in democratic control of the economy. And that is exactly what we need to be fighting for. So, okay. In this respect, my book, The Fall and Rise of American Finance, historicizes heterodox theories of money, credit, and finance. It looks at the ways in which the institutional capacities and functions of the financial system developed to carry out the functions that are described in those heterodox theories of money, credit, and finance. How did the financial system develop the capacities to circulate investment, to create money and credit in the way that those theories describe? We have to understand this historically. How did the system that those theories describe actually emerge? And in particular, to show how the capacities of the state itself were formed to support this system through its attempts to manage historically emergent disciplines, contradictions, and crises of capitalism. So the broader claim, in addition to the 1970s, the post-1970s moment, going back to the 19th century, is that financialization is not new, right? Financialization was there at the creation of capitalism. Without financialization, you don't have the giant corporation under the tutelage of J.P. Morgan at that time. Furthermore, the current stage of financialization actually finds its origins in the heart of the post-war golden age of capitalism, which is oftentimes held up as the supposedly pre-financial period that we all want to go back to, right? Good industrial capital-led capitalism rather than bad financial capital-led capitalism. In addition, finance and industry are not separate, right? They're completely integrated, and their interests have never been more closely interconnected than they are now. So there is no currently available social democratic class compromise that is on the table for workers. We need to confront the entirety of the capitalist class who has shared interests in perpetuating globalization and maximizing the exploitation of working people. Class compromise strategies simply aren't going to work. The problem, in short, that we face, just to conclude, is capitalism itself. Not finance, not monopolization, not the political corruption of money in politics. We need to take on capitalism. And the social democratic compromise that is so often dreamed of, that we can return to, where we can form partnerships with industrial capital to limit financial predation, is not available to workers today. And this isn't because of a lack of structural economic space. Profits are at record highs. There is certainly the capacity in the system to support higher wages for workers. Understanding why the social democratic compromise is not on the table, therefore, requires that we look at the historical and institutional reality of capitalism, the shared interests of capitalists in perpetuating globalization and exploitation. It is this impasse, the impasse of social democratic politics and the delegitimation of capitalism that has followed from the impasse of social democratic politics, along with the failure of the left up until now to provide a real alternative to capitalist exploitation and environmental destruction that is currently responsible for the dangerous shift toward neo-fascism that is now happening. And so I think these historical lessons couldn't be more pressing for the left as we try to think through what we're going to do about it. Thank you.
Alrighty, and now we have the substitute of Robert Brenner, his student, Sam Salour, researcher at UC Santa Barbara.
Thank you. So the main difference between Bob and I is that my introduction took 10 seconds. His would have taken 10 minutes, right? But I'm going to follow in his footsteps in being controversial and like annoy most of you here, because that's just what happens after Bob talks. I'm going to start by taking a different track than David did in sort of criticizing the new histories of capitalism, and then move on from there, I think, to try to say what bothers me today about mostly sort of Marxist analysis of the history of capitalism and capitalism as such. David mentioned that in the new histories of capitalism, what's forgotten is the dirt and blood, right? The exploitation of the workers and the labor embodied. That is true in most sort of mainstream writing. Exploitation, dirt and blood is forgotten. But I think what's fundamentally forgotten in the new histories of capitalism is capitalism itself. If you look at the writings, while everything is about the history of capitalism, they never bother to define what the term means, right? Capitalism generally refers to the past few centuries, right, or recent times. And it raises a question. What exactly is the use, like analytical use of the term capitalism, of something such as the logic of capital for historical analysis, beyond saying that there are workers, there are capitalists, and like workers are exploited by capitalists, right? One of my perhaps first controversial points is that a lot of the times as Marxists we think that our job is to talk about exploitation, right? Is to talk about class struggle. That those were the fundamental contributions of Marx, right? Exploitation and class struggle. I don't think that's true. I think Marx's main contribution was the specific form of class struggle and the specific form of class exploitation and the logics of development that arise from them in a capitalist society as opposed to a pre-capitalist society. You know, he almost like took it for granted. It was his starting point that workers are being exploited. The dirt and blood were his starting point. I don't think it was his main contribution to bring those out. So the problem with the histories of capitalism, interestingly, Sven Beckert himself, in a recent book, Capitalism, the Reemergence of a New History, he himself sort of recognizes this struggle, right? And I have this quote from him. I don't really like his writing, to be honest, but this quote really brings out the point I'm trying to make. I see a yet unresolved and perhaps unresolvable tension between a new history of capitalism that emphasizes diversity, local conditions, particular forms, and forms of organization, and a diversity of labor mobilization, so slavery, bonded labor, workers, and a view of capitalism based on an assumption of a core identifying logic that sets this form of the organization of economic activity apart from the others. If we quite usefully emphasize the importance of politics, of law, of the state, of culture, of religion, I can add of exploitation, of so much more, of history and so on, are we in effect undermining the very notion that there is such a thing as capitalism, right? To me, that's true of either mainstream or Marxist writing. I think one of the dangers of us when we try to do too much empirical analysis, which is great, we should, that's the starting point, no question, is that there's also the danger of getting lost in all of it. And we end up describing all aspects of reality, but then we hardly go beyond description. And then we have a token, we say, yes, this is all capitalism, there are workers and there are capitalists, but now let me go talk about banking, and then we end up describing various aspects of banking, we end up describing various aspects of finance, we end up describing various aspects in which workers are exploited. But then in the midst of that, I find that we lose historical narratives, we lose explanation. and we just end up with description. That's the new history of capitalism. So what's the way out of this? Here is, I want to bring Brenner, I'm just going to call him Bob Brenner, because most of these debates started in the 70s, right? Basically, how do we use the concept of capitalism, and how is it useful as an analytical category, not just something that's bad, something that we need to get rid of. And Bob's main objection to the literature of the time, and most of this is in the context of the question of economic development, something that is like fundamental for most of us today. How do we understand economic development, right? Bob raised two fundamental questions. The first one was where everyone was looking at the world market growing in the 14th and the 15th century and said, well, this is a capitalist world market. Capitalist is a worldwide phenomena. We have accumulation, we have exploitation, we have people accumulating capital, therefore we have capitalism, right? And Bob's simple question was, yes, we have accumulation, we have exploitation, there are workers in factories producing textiles, the merchants are selling them, the merchants are getting rich, but why is any of that capitalist? What makes any of that capitalist, right? Because most pre-capitalist societies have been quite compatible with extensive networks of trade, of commodity production, of monetary exchange, right? His second question was when we looked at the issue of dependency, right? And of course, even up to today, a dominant view in the heterodox circles is that, well, why is it that so much of the world did not develop, but like England did, or the US did? Well, it's because they prevented the development of the rest of the world, right? This view is not necessarily incorrect, but there is a dangerous assumption here. A dangerous assumption that Bob pointed out, and I think it still haunts the development literature, that if it were not for England's colonization, that if it were not for the US or England, all of these other places would have developed as England and the US did. Right? That they were on the tracks of developing. Many of them actually, let's take India, let's take China, they were actually more developed economically up to just a few hundred years ago than Britain was, right? So then Britain's takeover is only possible by stopping the rest. And of course, Bob objected by saying that you are essentially assuming not economic development as such, but capitalist economic development. Right? That we are assuming that every country is sort of destined to make a transition into capitalism and to have capitalist economic development. Of course, the issue here is not differentiating between forms of economic development, capitalist development as opposed to pre-capitalist development, right? So while England's colonization has certainly retarded the development of many places, there was absolutely no reason for them to have capitalist development. And this created a question. Essentially, two spaces for theoretical development came out of these two objections of Bob. One is, clearly there was a disagreement on what capitalism even is, if it's not just about accumulation of wealth, right? And given that most of these people have already read Marx, reading Marx and then constantly reinterpreting value theory in different ways was not enough. A new way of looking at Marx's categories was required. This is what Ellen Wood tried to do, which I will get to in a second. The second issue was, if we cannot equate development as such with capitalist development, the immediate question was, and the world market is not necessarily capitalist, well, how did capitalism come to be? This is, of course, the famous origins debate, right? The debate existed before Brenner, Morris Dobb, Sweezy, Rodney Hilton, but Bob picks up the debate, and of course the debate is now named after him, the Brenner debate. And Bob's fundamental reformulation of Marx in this regard was that for Marx, what was the distinguishing feature of capitalism was neither commodity production as such or monetary exchange, was this specific form of surplus extraction, i.e. the specific form of class relation, not class struggle, but the structure of the class relation within which class struggle happens in a specific form that distinguished capitalism from a pre-capitalist society. And then Marx later on wants to show that commodities and money, and even capital, while they existed before capitalism, under capitalism they become forms of this class relation. This is why in a footnote in volume 1 of Capital, Marx says, what distinguishes me from classical political economy is that I theorize commodity, money, and capital as forms of value. They are value forms. Value itself referring to this class relation, right? So then the key, what was the historical consequence of this perspective? Was that in order to find capitalism, looking at money and commodity is not enough. We need to find where the class relation changed and how did that happen, right? And I find today when, for example, if we look at a lot of literature on the development of East Asia, the development of China, the development of a lot of other places, what we look at is industry, finance, money, commodity production, all of which is great. But we rarely look at the class relation itself, right? And I think there is a lot of danger here if we forget the question of transition when looking at the question of development. Because what if we end up with these situations that don't really exist in our categories, where you can have extensive development, but no capitalist class relation? And then it also becomes very dangerous in historical analysis when we immediately go on to use Marx's categories for analyzing development when we have not yet established whether or not capitalism exists. So then, how do we further categorize or understand capitalism? Here is when Ellen Wood comes in. She emphasizes a few points that what is the meaning of the relation of surplus extraction or exploitation changing? She says we need to understand basically two things. I have 1 minute, so I have to be faster. She's going to shout at me if I go for more than a minute. She says that key things that change from pre-capitalism to capitalism are that market opportunities turn into market imperatives, meaning that either a capitalist or a worker, you are dependent on the market. You are under the subject of market imperatives. And that's basically, to me, what Marx meant by value theory. Furthermore, she says, extra economic or political coercion of the peasantry turns into the economic coercion of the working class, right? And I'm going to end by just saying the objections to this view, and I think those objections are problematic. The main objections to this view have been, if we think of capitalism as economic as opposed to extra economic coercion, as market imperatives, how do we make sense of the extensive history of colonialism and overt forms of political coercion, let's say by the British? How do we make sense of racism? How do we make sense of the exploitation of women at home, none of which are economic forms of coercion? And the way people have tried to solve this by abandoning those concepts, by abandoning capital as a form of economic coercion, right? Whereas, and I'm going to end here by saying that the solution here is not to say, well, these historical facts don't really fit that pure understanding of capital. Therefore, we need to change our understanding of capital to somehow incorporate everything under it. I think the solution is to understand that colonialism, male domination, racism have existed throughout history. The question is not to expand the logic of capital, but to ask, what are the forms of colonialism, slavery, imperialism, racial domination, gender domination under this now a specific mode of surplus extraction, right? So the question of forms here is integrated into historical analysis, sort of maintaining the logic of capital as Marx described it, I think. Thank you.
Wonderful. Now we have some time for interventions by the audience so that we can get some debate going, and then we'll give it back to the speakers. I'll bring around the... Let's see. Okay, let's go for those who have not spoken yet. So Meryl, you want to present yourself? Stand up if you can.
Hi. Hi, my name is Merle. I'm a student at UMass in the PhD program, Economics. I know you should never ask historians to speculate about the current moment, but I was wondering if you would be willing to do so anyway. So I was wondering, I guess it's a question addressed to all of you, but I mean, maybe mostly Stephen. I was recently reading Lenin on imperialism and was kind of trying to make sense of that moment of World War I, the imperialist wars, and how he obviously describes it in relation to monopoly capitalism. Then I was thinking through, why didn't we in the 70s see imperialist wars as the solution to, you know, a crisis of profitability? Why did we see that solution of, like, you know, financialization and what would you obviously critique as a concept, but subordination of labor, you know, by ever-intensifying competition, as you would explain it. And then what is the current moment going to bring? Are we going to see a return to some form of imperialism? How can we make sense of that if we don't believe that monopoly capitalism is a good way to understand the current moment? I don't know, if you guys could speculate on the current geopolitical configurations. Thanks.
Then we had a question here. Come closer.
Sure. Bryce Rossler, Freedom Road Socialist Organization. I'm glad that the last speaker mentioned Ellen Myskin's Wood's book, but when I speak to other workers about capitalism, something that often comes up is the idea that capitalism is some sort of inevitable end stage of humanity and or a manifestation of human nature. And in her book, which you mentioned, she traced like the land enclosure in England and the development of capitalism in the English countryside in the 17th century as being an emergent factor in this, like the uniquely speculative way that they treated land rents as distinct from other European colonial powers. And that like disavows us of the notion that this was a natural, inevitable process. And I think that's important because the conclusion when you have the idea that this is a natural thing is that you can't conceive of an alternative. If capitalism is inevitable or some manifestation of human nature, then it is what it is. And secondly is that in the United States specifically, there's a generally like anti-intellectual attitude among the population. Like if you try to speak to the average person about technical theories or abstract ideas, their eyes start to glaze over. So but like people understand these things. Like people feel the weight of capitalism pushing down on them. They may not understand why. Like a factory worker may not be familiar with Frederick Winslow Taylor's principles of scientific management, but they feel it, right? So my question, I guess I have two questions. One is, what do you see the role for heterodox economics being in synthesizing these ideas in digestible ways for the masses and not just students and academics? And two, how does collaboration with other disciplines factor into that?
Thank you. There are many other hands. Let's get these three, then Ricardo, and then we give it back to you, and then we'll do a second round. We have time. This will be the first one.
Hi, my name is Panos Soukalis. I'm a student in philosophy at the New School and a fellow in the World Inequality Database in Paris. So my background is in economics. So I want to contrast two different perspectives, which I understand they emerge from the different topics, but nevertheless I think they are representative of two different approaches to capitalism between David McNally's speech and Stephen Maher's speech. On the former, we heard an emphasis on the dirt, the blood, and that side of the history of capitalism, which you can extend to also being a logic, an aspect of the logic of capitalism. My sense was that in Stephen's speech, there was more of an emphasis on the rationality of capitalism, of the pureness of capitalism, that I understand very well the point of the argument in the context of trying to show, and very powerfully so, and I've really learned a lot from your book, and I really, really enjoyed reading it, that a social democratic compromise is not the strategy we should be striving for. But I want to ask primarily Stephen, but the rest of the panel as well, don't we lose something by emphasizing that only the rational side of capitalism? That also capitalism is not only, it's not only that we want to overthrow it, to work against it, because it works perfectly by its own standards, it's also stupid sometimes. It's also irrational very often. And for instance, in the context of the state, I wonder that, I think that it is a very powerful argument to show that the state works with a relative autonomy from capital, but works to further the interests of capital and to bridge over all of the contradictions of capital, even if liberal democracy works perfectly. So that's a very powerful argument. But at the same time, liberal democracy does not work perfectly. Like, it's, especially in this country, it's a joke very often. So that dirty, you can say often bloody as well, aspect of capitalism, that irrational aspect, especially in the context of climate change. Like if we talk about capital accumulation, what about the way that capitalism contributes to the own demise of human civilization at the moment in a highly irrational way? How does that perspective factor in to your narrative? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll grab the mic while it's here. I'm Anna Pick. I'm a grad student in economics, also at the New School. I have a question actually for David in particular. I was very interested by your presentation. I was thinking as you were speaking and also staring at this timeline about some insights from Black feminist scholarship on this issue, and I just wondered if you could comment. First, that the enslaved person is actually both producer and commodity and therefore has a unique relation to the value and production process. Second, that enslaved women have a unique relation to the labor process in the sense of enforced reproduction and the removal of children. And third, that some of the most important practices of resistance to slavery, as emphasized by Hartman in particular, as practiced by Black women as well, in the everyday experience are actually invisible and happen in the shadows. For example, hiding, shirking, secret rituals, collection of funds, etc., escape, secret intimacies and relationships. I just wondered how you would integrate those insights into global labor history.
Last two questions, then we do a second round. We have, we do one Talha and one Riccardo. Who wants to go first? Riccardo?
To Sam Salour, I think you wanted to displease the audience, but I enjoyed all that you said. I agree 99% except for a very important 1%. That is, you can't divide value and money. So going towards a full, real analysis, I think it's a problem. But for the rest, I agree completely. To Stephen Maher, it's a minor point, but I know Cedric Durand. And I don't see him in what you said. You know, the point is to recognize that the relationship between finance or financial capital and industrial capital is functionary and contradictory. So you can't divide the two things. The real point, and I close with this, is on the first part of Stephen Maher, the methodological part, that I enjoyed very much, and the attempt is again to link the sessions. Piero Sraffa in 1927, when he started to think of the book, he said, what should I do? I have to go through history in reverse, fare la storia a ritroso, the history of economic thought backwards, from the present to the past. It is the opposite than the continuous view. It is to show how present theory came to be reached, showing the difference and the superiority of the old theories. This was actually the style of Italian thinkers like Napoleone, Graziani, but I think many, many others. And what is intriguing in this approach is that you can't do economic theory today without at the same time doing history of political economy, and the reverse.
So first I just want to say a comment, which is I think this is probably the single best panel I've attended in the last 10 years, and I just want to thank all of you and the people organizing it. This was unbelievable as a matter of one after the other. I just have to say I'm blown away. So my comment is really a little more, very minor, but I just want to sort of build on what Sam started with, which is I think fundamental, which is that the differentia specifica of Marx's analysis of capitalism cannot be class and exploitation, because that is not the differentia specifica of capitalism, right? It's the specific way in which capitalism transforms other forms of class relations. And the way it does it is, of course, by intercoupling vertical class relations with horizontal relations of ceaseless market competition. And I think this feeds very nicely into Stephen's point, which is exactly that. The monthly school vertical focus on monopoly misses the story of capitalism. And I just want to sort of, so I'm very sympathetic with all this, but I just think we should name that the reason people always go back to a vertical understanding of capitalism is because once you intertwine the vertical and horizontal, both as a matter of agents of transformation and the critique of transformation and the program of transformation become much harder. But I think that is what has to be named and put on the table. That once you understand the differentia specifica of capitalism as being precisely the intertwining of the vertical and horizontal in an unprecedented way, leading to unprecedented alienated domination and productivity, the agents and program of transformation become much harder to articulate. And I think we have to sort of be honest about that to some extent. I'm completely sympathetic with the project. I think what you guys did is brilliant. I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
That's great. Alrighty, so we have time, so let's give it back to our speakers. What order should we follow? Let's follow the order in which you started, no? Or you tell me. Yeah? Trevor? Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll be brief because I think most of the questions were mainly aimed towards David. So I think the only thing that I'm going to specifically respond to is the question about how to translate these theories to explain them to regular people, and I sort of mentioned that, I don't know, American workers might have a strain of anti-intellectualism, and I actually think that that's the wrong approach. And I think that very much from many of the conversations from yesterday, which is to say, I think it's a mistake for us to approach non-academic workers and community organizers from the perspective of saying, I know what your problem is. I read it in volume 3 of Capital, and I've figured out, I figured out the transformation problem, and so I'm going to tell you what your problem is in a way that you can understand. I actually think that the correct approach is to ask them what their problems are and what they need, and to listen to what they say, even if they are people who you might think you are politically opposed to, because they might speak a very different idiom from heterodox economics, but almost certainly they hate their boss, and almost certainly they hate their landlord, and we know for damn sure they hate their health insurance company, right? And so I think that there are many more points of continuity there, and I think for that reason, what I was very struck by from some of the conversations yesterday, I don't know where our Icelandic trade union organizer went, but I found very striking when she said that she had specific problems. She goes to the negotiating table and the economists do their math and they always say the same thing, which is that wages can't increase. And I thought, well, look, she doesn't need us to explain Marx to her. What she needs is a set of intelligible, usable answers to respond to those economist questions, right? So she's telling us what she needs and we should be able to supply it in a useful way. And I think that listening to workers about what they need is probably a better approach than proceeding from the assumption that we have all the answers and we know better. And I would also say that I think, just as a final point, that it's a translation error to believe that there's a strain of anti-intellectualism in average Americans. I think that I could probably leave here right now and have a very sophisticated conversation with anybody on the street about like the blitz rate of the Philadelphia pass rush, and they would be able to speak in very, very specific detail about that. Only like 4 of you understood what I just said, but those who did, right, you're with me on this. Right? It's a different kind of intellectualism, right? It's an intellectualism that speaks to people's experience in a way that perhaps the transformation problem of Volume 3 doesn't. And so I don't think that we should proceed under the assumption that there is a rampant intellectualism so much as I think we should realize that what we think is important and what is important to workers in the world are not necessarily the same thing, and that we should listen to them about what they need.
I'll just make one quick comment on the last point, which is to say, in the spirit of what Trevor is saying, the relationship between activists, organizers, and those of us who do intellectual work professionally has to be dialogical. It has to be dialogical. And the moment we imagine that holding forth monologically is any route towards the emancipation of the workers of the world, come on, folks, let's get serious. We have a huge learning project as people who are professionally intellectuals if we're going to be relevant to all kinds of labor, community, social justice type organizing. On the rationality question, you know, I think the key for us always is to emphasize that the micro-rationality of the capitalist firm is in aggregate irrational. And therefore, that there is baked into the DNA of the system, the logic of capital, is social irrationality. And that's, I think, in many ways, something that disunites what we've all been saying. The big historical question that's kind of the backdrop to all of this is what Marx tries to do in Part 8 of Capital Volume 1, the origins question, the primitive accumulation of capital, or, as I think Ian Angus correctly gets it, when Marx gives a famous speech to a group of workers in London, and he calls it originary expropriation. Much, much better translation than primitive accumulation. That capitalism cannot get going as a historical possibility unless masses and masses of people somewhere are dispossessed of their means of producing the means of life for themselves, their own means of production and subsistence. And that dispossession is at the core. Then you have to have that unique social relationship in which Mr. Moneybags meets on the market people who are dispossessed of means of producing for themselves. What I'm trying to develop within this is the recognition that what happened to those 12 million Africans sold into slavery? They were dispossessed of the means of producing for themselves, and their labor power was sold as a pseudo-commodity of the, the person. But therefore you get the commodification of persons which can never be completed. That's my whole point, is that you cannot, in fact, adequately commodify people. And one of the little banners that I use in the book is to say, constant capital does not strike. I repeat that, constant capital does not strike. Only living labor does that. And once we recognize that, then we need to theorize in a very, very different way. Anna, your question is really, really important, and I do try to take this up extensively, because one of the things that Marx leaves dangling in Capital, he tells us the special commodity is labor power. He doesn't tell us how this labor power is going to be regularly, systematically, and generationally reproduced. He tells us capital can leave that to the natural instincts of the worker, which is wrong. Marx goes for a naturalistic solution to a social problem. Social reproduction theory within Marxism, sometimes known as Marxist feminism or Marxist social reproduction theory, has come in at exactly this point and said, what about those labor processes that produce labor power? Some of them are socialized, teachers, healthcare workers, daycare workers, and so on, and many of them remain privatized in private households. But that is an integral part of the reproduction of the working class, and so theoretically, we have to be able to address that. I tried to do that in the study, mentioning some of the people that you've mentioned. Whether I'm adequate to the task is I leave for all of you to decide if you actually take the time to read what I have written on it. Final point was the first question on the current moment, and because I don't want to overtake my time, I will simply say this. I believe that neoliberalism has been in a disintegrating moment since the global crisis of 2007 to 9, but that it remains chaotic and incapable at this moment of establishing a robust new accumulation regime. I think Kostas yesterday used the term interregnum. But the interregnum can just be chronic chaos and disintegration that's constantly trying to re-scramble itself to hold together. And so Trumpism is one set of responses to those disintegrating tendencies of the neoliberal accumulation regime. We don't know where they lead. Now, on imperialism and rivalry, my view, Lenin's right about rivalry. His explanation doesn't fit our world, okay? But he's right about rivalry. His particular explanation about the export of capital and all of that, no. It's not gonna hold to explain our moment. And at the core, we need to get always at the core question. When Trump is after tariffs, forget the playing around with fentanyl in Canada and Mexico and all of that. That's the sideshow. China. It's a US-China rivalry because there has been, over the last 40 years, a new center of global accumulation has emerged. And what the US state and ruling class is most preoccupied with is the US-China rivalry, which is why Trump's moves are actually continuous with Biden's. And so we need to understand imperialism today in terms of the rivalries involved with key centers of accumulation, and those have been changing across the neoliberal period, and it reconfigures the way in which global imperialism looks today. That's a whole other discussion, and I know I need to pass to Steve.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so maybe I'll just start where David ended with a comment about Lenin and imperialism. As you mentioned, Lenin's focus is on monopoly capitalism and the ways in which the monopolization of the national market led to the overaccumulation of capital by large firms and therefore created the need for those firms to export capital. And the forms that took was carving out exclusive economic territories which were for the sole exploitation of nationally specific capitalist classes. And this is important in terms of the question of the history of capitalism because it gets at the historical specificity of imperialism, right? Marx and Engels in the Manifesto talked about capital's tendency to settle everywhere, nestle everywhere, establish connections everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. And that's oftentimes taken as very prophetic, and indeed it was. Capital does have that tendency, as we can all see around us every single day. Nevertheless, the forms that internationalization takes are historically specific. So at the time Lenin was writing, there was indeed inter-imperial rivalry between externally related imperial systems, which were nationally specific between the core country and between the metropole country and its colonial territories that it was exporting capital into and extracting value from. After World War II, this logic changes. We enter a new historical moment defined by the unique role of the American state, unprecedented in history, in uniting the world system into one single global capitalism. Not competing national capitalisms, not competing imperial systems, one global capitalism. It doesn't mean that competition goes away, of course, as I was just explaining, and it doesn't mean that interstate conflict goes away, but it means that the contradictions within this system, given that the system is indeed organized through national states, which remain relatively autonomous from each other within the structure of the American empire, those forms of conflict and contestation take different forms. And so what you see up to the 1970s crisis, and the system is united based on the free movement of capital. It's stitched together by the large multinational corporations who circulate investment around the planet. In fact, if you look, a huge proportion of global trade, something like over 60%, depending on what numbers you look at, actually consists of the movements of value within multinational corporations. Right? Many countries' leading exports are exports within a single corporation. And so you have this system stitched together by multinational corporate investment and organized through national states. So there is conflict between these national states. And the forms that conflict takes now, especially as David was just mentioning, vis-a-vis the US and China, is very different than the kind of conflict we saw, say, between the United States and the Soviet Union, between two completely different socioeconomic orders. And it was very different than the kind of inter-imperial rivalry we saw leading up to World War I and ultimately World War II. Instead, we have a Chinese economy that is deeply integrated within American-led global capitalism, right? Deeply integrated within American-led global capitalism. The dollar remains world money, right? Organized and reproduced by the American state. And China has been seeking different terms of integration within that that global system managed by the American state. And that includes the growing threat of nuclear confrontation between the US and China. So China is deeply integrated with the system, but there's a lot of contradictions of that. And I think what David said is very correct, that what has happened, especially in the recent decades, has been a kind of fragmentation of the American imperial system, but a fragmentation that is contained still within the overarching structure of American hegemony. And that has taken the form of increasing security conflicts between different national states, whose autonomy, relatively speaking, is a part of the way that system is established and organized. And I think theorizing that and thinking that through requires a lot of intellectual and theoretical energies that people have to devote in the coming period to understanding what's going on. But certainly, in a context in which the American state is the #1 recipient of foreign direct investment inflows in the entire world, it would certainly be absurd to suggest that foreign direct investment itself is somehow constitutive of an imperial relationship. That would mean that the United States is the most imperially dominated country on the planet. Clearly, that's not the case. So we have to think through the current forms that this is taking and the nature of the conflicts that we're seeing, which are quite different. For example, after the 2008 crisis, the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, bailed out central banks all around the planet, at least central banks in the dollar zone, by supplying them with unlimited swap lines of credit, that is to say, unlimited dollars to support their financial systems, including China. Right? And if there was a big financial meltdown today, the same thing would happen. I don't think that would have occurred between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I don't think that would have occurred between the leading capitalist powers in the lead up to World War I. So we're looking at a very, very different system, and understanding the nature of the contradictions of that system requires that we have historically specific understanding of how that works. Now, I don't want to go on very much longer because I know we have to get on, but I wanted to make one last comment about the dirt and blood in the history of capitalism that David mentioned, because this is actually quite important, and the way I see this is that there's a division of labor. Like, if I was writing a book about the history of global capitalism and financialization in the American economy, and I also then wrote about all of the violent and coercive measures that are necessary to implement a monetary economy, which is by no means occurring through nature, but has to be instantiated through violence on living human beings who don't necessarily want to accept those kinds of economic relations. Or, of course, as we all know, the American empire could hardly be said to be bloodless in its rise, which was a condition for the free mobility of capital internationally and the competitiveness that I just was referring to. So, including, several million people killed in Vietnam, including now the genocide that's happening in Gaza. So it's certainly not bloodless. But I think there's a division of labor in our historical focus in which, David has written an excellent book on blood and money, the way that the rise of a monetary economy was dripping in blood in the ways that he mentioned. And so I think we're just kind of looking at different things, but to me, these are not exclusive in any way. They go together, and we all are kind of participating in a common project in that way. One last point about capitalism being stupid. I really like that point, because capitalism is really stupid. But I think this is kind of how I see the difference between Ralph Miliband and Nikos Poulantzas in a way, for those of you who are familiar with this relatively arcane debate in the history of Marxist thought. Ralph Miliband says, look, the capitalists control the state because the capitalists are in the state, and they're connected to the state, and they know people in the state. Nikos Poulantzas says, you know what? Even if they're not, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because they don't have to be. The state is a capitalist state even without that. And so I think that's a very, very important critique that hones in on the radicalism that we have to focus on, because it doesn't matter if we exclude the capitalists from participating in the state, right? The social democratic parties in Europe were historically, to a large extent, successful in limiting campaign contributions and campaign financing of those parties. And yet every single one of them is adopting neoliberalism. So campaign contributions are not the problem, right? Capitalist personnel are not the problem. And I think that is a really important way of looking at things. And certainly in terms of the environment, I am very influenced by the work of Paul Burkett. Those of you who might be familiar, the late Paul Burkett, I recommend his work very, very highly. And what he basically shows is how the logic of capital, if you like, as laid out by Marx in Capital, is fundamentally at odds with both human development and the sustainability of the relationship to nature. And I think that what that points to is is kind of the same kind of argument I was making, that the health of capitalism, the strength of capitalism, comes at the expense of the planet and human beings. And as Clara said yesterday, right, the contradiction between the logic of need and the logic of profit. This is the central message, I think. The logic of profit winning means the logic of need, to some extent, loses out. Human beings become stunted in human development terms, and nature is disrupted in ways that are potentially existentially impacting human civilization.
All right, I'm going to give a few quick answers, and then I want to spend time on the current moment, though probably not in a very satisfactory way. So on the irrationality issue, like, I agree. I think we should be less happy about the irrationality of capitalism and much more worried about its genius. Because despite the fact that it destroys its own basis, it's so malleable, it's like so powerful in like rectifying all of that and like changing its ideologies and like looking different every time. And I think that's what's really dangerous about it. And it also has this obviously like built-in mechanism of dealing with the irrationality between micro and macro within itself. Like that's the business cycle. Like every business cycle, it deals with that and it goes ahead. As the question of value and money, I completely agree. Like value cannot exist outside of money. But I think sometimes we forget this, and even in the work of someone like Heinrich, we kind of have this new Smithianism where money, as Blood and Money shows, money existed before capitalism, obviously, like, and it was a terrible social institution, but value did not, right? So what's really distinct about capitalism is not monetary production, as Keynes would say, but it's value production, which necessarily takes a monetary form. Regarding of like what I said, well, I was told to behave. But the fact is, like, the perspective that I try to defend is regularly in the Journal of Capital and Class or Historical Materialism or other journals is designated as Eurocentric, racist, and sexist, right? Because supposedly it fails to incorporate non-European paths to capitalist development. It fails to incorporate social reproduction or racism under capitalism. And like, to clarify, when it comes to the issue of social reproduction, I think there is a lot of approaches that try to begin from Marx's categories, such as value, such as abstract labor, and then ask the question, when it comes to the question of reproducing the labor power, how can we change those categories to incorporate that? That's precisely what I'm saying is a mistake. In my view, that's a completely mistaken approach. Whereas the other approach should be, what is the form of social reproduction under capitalism as opposed to feudalism, as opposed to what existed before? It's that historical approach that needs to be our starting point. And a lot of the times, in so much of our analysis, Marx's categories have become our starting point rather than history, right? That's true of issues of race and issues of gender, I think. And I think those are mistaken approaches. Lastly, I just want to briefly talk about the current moment. My view is I think the way in which we look at the current moment and debate it essentially has not changed since the 70s. I think we are within the same paradigm of debate, right? And that, I think, is creating problems. The paradigm I like to put forward exists. It's not completely new. As much as today's world is different, I think if you look at even the stuff that we are debating, there are stark similarities. We are talking about, is neoliberalism over or not? Is globalization over or not? Do we have secular stagnation or not, right? These are the stuff. Okay, who were the people that debated these identical questions? Early 20th century, both mainstream and Marxist thinkers. The question at the time was, has the age of British liberalism ended or not? The question at that time was, has the globalization of late 19th century ended or not? Keynes is the product of that debate. The debate at that time was, are we in an era of secular stagnation or not? The exact same things that we are debating. So I think the best way to try and make sense of the moment is through a historical comparative picture that looks at the evolution of post-World War II capitalism up to today and compares it with the evolution of capitalism under the British hegemony as it was chased by the US and Germany leading into the conflicts of the First World War, the Second World War, and the stagnation of the 30s. That framework, in my view, can tell us best of what we can expect moving forward.